Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Andrew Perchuk, Deputy Director of the Getty Research Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the second in our Dancers on Film series, 2 by Madeleine Hunt-Ehrlich. I'm very pleased to say that we have attendees for today's program throughout Central and South America, Africa, Europe, and North America. And I think it's important for me to acknowledge that though I am not actually at the Getty, the virtual background, that I am on traditional Tongva and Gabrielino land. Today's program is in conjunction with both the Getty Research Institute's African American Art History Initiative and with the first exhibition that is coming out of that initiative, Blondell Cummings, Dance's Moving Pictures, which will present in collaboration and at the site Art and Practice in Leimert Park here in Los Angeles in the fall. The subject of dance and dance on film is one that is very well represented in the Getty Research Institute collections. We not only have the archives of dancer and choreographers like Yvonne Rainer and Simone Forti, but we have the archive of the kitchen, which was one of the great homes, particularly for experimental dance and dance on film from the era of Bill T. Jones and the postmodern dance scene of the 1970s all the way to the present. What we lacked until recently was someone who could pull these threads together on dance and film. But I'm very proud to say that we now have such a person, Kristin Juarez, our research specialist for the African American Art History Initiative. And I'm delighted to turn things over to Kristin now.
Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank Chelsea Anderson for facilitating this program and screening, along with Andrea Vancura, Adrian Cazares, Gus Kowalewski, and Bill King for their AV support. As Andrew mentioned, I'm Kristin Juarez, and I am the research specialist for the African American Art History Initiative. Again, I'd like to welcome you to the second program in this Dancers on Film series. This series looks at formal experiments between the moving image and the moving body. And it asks us to consider how we archive dance and what dance can archive. In the first program, we engaged the choreographers Okwe Apokwasili and Devin Emery as they made dance films in response to the early days of COVID and the blossoming social justice movement for Black lives. The relationship between Black dance and the moving image dates back to the invention of American film technology, and has been an innovative force in cinematic storytelling. Of course, no discussion on the links between dance and cinema can be complete without a focus on the musical and the genre's unique place in American cinema. Today, I'm very excited to be in conversation with the filmmaker, Madeleine Hunt-Ehrlich. Madeleine Hunt-Ehrlich's work has screened all over the world, including the Guggenheim Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, New Orleans Film Festival, Duckley's Boa, True False Film Festival, and Black Star Film Festival. She was named on Filmmaker magazine's 2020 list of 25 faces of independent cinema. She's the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including a 2020 Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship and a 2019 Undo and Ford Foundation Fellowship. She's also the recipient of a 2019 Rima Hort Mann Award and a 2015 TFI Future Filmmaker Award, along with a 2014 Princess Grace Award in film. Her first feature film, Madame Negritude, has received support from San Francisco Film Society's Rainin Grant for the screenwriting phase and was a 2020 finalist at the Biennale College Cinema, the Venice Film Festival's prestigious film lab and fund. Madeleine and I will begin in conversation today around the influence of musicals in her practice, and we'll also discuss the film Swing Time, which will continue to be available to stream for free through tomorrow. We'll move into the screening of 2 works by her, including Footnote to the West and Spit on the Broom. And these films have a total running time of 17 minutes. From there, we'll open up the conversation to Q&A, and I invite you all to submit questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I'll fold them in as we continue to talk about her work. Madeleine's work layers cinema histories and archival records, real and imaginative stories to create complex and poetic narratives centered around women of color. In her film Quality of Light, the narrator claims the archive is impermanent and imperfect in what it reveals. As such, they blur the distinctions between folklore and documentary, creating a diegesis or a world of the film that is both grounded in reality and surreal, unbound by the rules of invisible cinema and singular notions of truth. As her camera looks into the lives of others, her work is often self-reflexive. She exposes the filmmaking process and the performances of her subjects. We are also regularly reminded of our own position as onlookers. In doing so, she asks us to acknowledge that some intimate knowledge may not be lost, simply unknown to us as viewers. Today, we'll discuss the ways musicals and archives have informed her experimental filmmaking practice and her use of histories of Blackness, performance, and cinema as material. I'd like to welcome Madeleine onto the screen. Hi there.
Hi, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm so glad this is being recorded. It's really lovely, and I'm so excited for this conversation. When you approached me about screening my work in relationship to Swing Time, I just felt like, wow, this woman really sees me. So I'm so excited to talk about this with you today.
The pleasure is all mine, Madeleine. I wanted to kind of start at the beginning and ask you a little bit about how you got into filmmaking and what the medium allows you to do.
Yeah, so I've had a very long, I think as many of us, I've had a very long love affair with film and with cinema and with old movies. But my path was not direct into filmmaking. I started out in still photography, which is what I studied in school. And I was really lucky to have in my early 20s, some really formative experiences working in other artist studios. So I worked for the artist Simone Lee, who has turned into a really wonderful and important collaborator over the past decade plus. I also worked for the photographer Jeannie Mutasami Ash, who is a kind of a reportage photographers, like really important work about the Gullah community in the coastal South. And I worked as a printer. I worked at Aperture, which is a photo book imprint. And so I was really in the still image space. And I just started to feel like there was more that I wanted, that like there was a limitation to the medium. And I went to film school. And I kind of haven't looked back since then. So that was like, I guess, kind of formally the journey. But, I think Swing Time really speaks to this. Like, from the time of adolescence, from the time that you're like kind of figuring out who you are and like encoding in some ways your identity. I just remember, sleeping, like being in and out of sleep to old movies. Like it was like in the air. It was just like, I was always watching, you know, like the old repertoire stations on cable that played all the black and white films. And like those rhythms were just such a part of how I understood the world and understood what was important and what joy was like. And so it feels kind of faded.
You mentioned at one point that for you, filmmaking is a medium that can be manipulated like sculpture or like painting. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the way I've come to think about film is deeply structural, um, in that I think that just like any other art form, film uses a set of languages. It's really interesting to me because I think I'm coming at it from, in part, kind of an art context or perspective. I'm not afraid of experimentation. But even from a commercial perspective, I think that like commercial studios and entities also understand that film is a language. They also understand that film isn't just a vehicle for selling things or entertainment, but like sometimes film is company while we sleep. Sometimes film is a soundtrack to our lives, that it's deeply ingrained in our bodies at this point, that the technology is one that speaks almost better than any other medium to our kind of physical lived experiences and can blur with our sense of those lived experiences. And so part of, for me, playing with those registers is like thinking of it spatially almost. Thinking that, knowing that our audience is living with the moving image, like we're all living with it constantly, and it's like deeply ingrained and shaping us. And knowing, okay, like what happens when I take this register? I know that that will make the body feel this way. And then what if I follow that with another register? I know that the body's gonna feel this way. So it's almost like you're creating a spatial experience, or I think of it that way. I think of it as very physical, and I think of it as like a set of languages that we can kind of understand what the outcome of those like syllables will be. Whereas in a commercial or a kind of traditional film structure, you might have like an order, so you almost know what comes next, right? Like I love Swing Time. I love those old movies because you can almost like play, like you know exactly when the lovers are going to fall out, and you know exactly when they're going to find each other again. But what I think is interesting is like pulling out some of those syllables and then using the next part of the sentence, using something that no one expects. And like, what does that do to the body of the audience experiencing that piece?
I think that's such a beautiful way to frame and give perspective into how we watch, particularly Spit on the Broom, and when that dance scene comes in. I do, before we get into the screening of that, as we started talking about like how that moment appears, this is kind of when you said, this is really inspired by Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And that kind of became the impetus for us to start thinking and talking about the role of musicals in your life, in your practice. So do you want to talk a little bit more about musicals in general, or specific works that kind of are really formative for you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say that pageantry is extremely Black. And so I feel that as a Black storyteller, Black image maker, that I'm working in really an ancient Black storytelling tradition, that you tell stories with pageantry, no matter how solemn or serious those stories might be. And there's no better pageantry than the musical. I grew up, I think I shared, very much in a kind of old film space. Like I wasn't allowed to watch cable, but I was allowed to watch old films. And it's kind of funny revisiting a lot of these films, like with Swing Time, as we've discussed, Kristin, in our conversation prior to this, you know, that Bojangles scene, like there's so many of those scenes just littered throughout our favorite films, our favorite old movies, right? Where we go back and we're like, wow, that was really racist, or, you know, like really sexist. But at the same time, there's something about like the, you know, kind of the borders of those films that I guess my parents felt was really appropriate. So I grew up watching those films, and they're deeply, deeply ingrained for me. Now, I also wanted to share, if I can, a film still that was equally inspirational for me in some of my choices in Spit on the Broom, to Swing Time, to the kind of Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire, like romantic moment. And this is a scene from a film called Hell's a Poppin', from around the same time, I think 1941. I'm gonna share a still from it. Bear with me. Are you able to see that, Kristin? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. So this scene from Hell's a Poppin', I mean, there's a number of films I feel like that did this at this time. I mean, this one does it in this way that I'm just obsessed with. I've like thought about trying to like sort of make a film where I just recreate this space. Maybe one day I will still do that. But in this scene, basically, you know, the main characters are white for this film, and it's like a musical review film, but there is this interlude where all the Black laborers, workers, you know, kind of quote the help, have this like full ensemble dance number in what is decidedly backstage space. So the space is like clearly marked and designed for you to feel like this is storage, this is backstage, this is private interior space. There's a quote unquote no audience or gaze, right? And this is like what happens in that Black interior space. This is what, you know, to be like a little crude, this is what the Blacks do when we're not around, right? And I feel like that was like such a trope of these films. Like I think of New Orleans, which had Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong in it, and like Billie Holiday plays a maid, and like, you know, you follow her to the after hour spot. Like the after hour spot is a thing, right? And it's like a really strong part of the imagination of like what Black people do when they're alone. And it was also kind of the ways that we existed in these films, even though these films, as I think the Bojangles scene shows in Swing Time, are super aware that they're playing with Black art, whether that's jazz, whether that's tap dance, you know, whether that's dance playing on the cakewalk, what, you know, or the ring shout. Like they know that they're like playing with Black material, and they like want to give some sense of that authenticity, and so they like create this offstage space. And something about that idea of the offstage space, but also like the attempt to like infiltrate, was also really formative to my choice in Spit on the Broom. I love this scene. Oh my God. I mean, I love Swing Time too, but.
One of the things that stands out to me that we can like, I think maybe look for as we watch some of your films was like the construction of the performance. Like there is supposed to be this off-screen space where it's not the invisible, perfect like stage or cinematic experience. And like that's the authenticity of it. And then also the idea of Blackness, right? It's like pulls it away from these specific people and creates this, like what you were saying, like this register or this rhythm that is a glimpse into what what the ideas of Black life might be. I wanted to bring in to this conversation a kind of a breakdown of that Harlem of Bojangles of Harlem scene at the end of Swing Time, and just to give a little bit of background or kind of context for the film. Swing Time was made in 1936. It was considered peak Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire musical. And this is actually a story to think about, like the lives of performers. Like it does very much center around Fred and Ginger's on-screen, but mostly off-screen life and off-stage life. And so it is this kind of delightful will they or won't they kind of film. But I think the undercurrent to it of the film, with its title, with its interludes, with their dancing with tap, is like, will they or won't they actually like bring Black people into the space? Will they acknowledge that this is that like the idea of Harlem is near or present? And so the film kind of leads up to Fred Astaire, or in the film, Lucky's debut at the opening of a nightclub. And his debut song is a number called Bojangles of Harlem. So I want to bring in a number of stills that kind of break down the appearance of Fred Astaire. So I'm going to do this. I learned recently it's Alt-Tab. Okay, I thought I was going to be able to do it, but I wasn't. So here we go. So it starts off here with this kind of, what would you call it? This abstract reduction of a Black figure and this kind of like essentialist trope of Blackface. And the dancers are kind of, they dance, the chorus line dance to reveal this figure. It's depersonalized to just an object and to commodity. And then we slowly get this kind of reveal into the derby hat lifting, and actually we're looking at a pair of the bottom of tap shoes. So this shift from animate to inanimate object, and then to this like slow reveal of these long legs, and ultimately to Fred Astaire in Blackface. And, you know, I think it's a kind of complicated, it's clearly complicated. In every kind of like review you read of Swing Time, it's considered a kind of like near perfect musical. And then the asterisk is always, but then there was this part. And I think it's worth considering kind of how it's functioning, how it kind of considers Blackness and Blackface. Blackface, I think, here is also functioning as a kind of visual cue to the history of performance and the history of vaudeville and Blackface that was worn by both Black and white performers. And for those who want to learn a little bit more, I would certainly direct you all to Brenda Dixon Gottschalk's book, Waltzing in the Dark, who is focusing specifically on race and vaudeville in the swing era. And she talks about Blackface being this kind of mask or disguise for deception and protection. And that kind of simultaneity and complexity of it for Black performers is put into conversation, or we can put that into conversation right now as we watch this. I don't know, Madeleine, if you've had, one thing that just stood out to me was like, this is just like a really surreal moment. Like,
right.
And
well, I love the way you broke that down, that it's like the shoes reveal this moment. But I also love, and I would completely agree, and that's how I think of it and use it too in my work, is that this kind of pageantry is a kind of protection. And it can be used at moments when we need that protection. And it has been used historically, quite literally, for survival. Whether you just want to think of certain kinds of ways Black people learn to perform in white space, to essentially to like repeal violence, to kind of protect themselves from violence, and like the ways that that has also been imagined by white authorship. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of notes there that felt very true to how I think of it as well.
And one thing, and I'm going to move kind of quickly through these, but one thing that's interesting to note is that the number is Bone Jagels of Harlem, and I think it like puts into conversation like a very specific person, a star and a celebrity, and like particularly their stardom and their dance, their tap dance, and the idea of Harlem. And so this is like a press photo, and on the back of it, it's like, this is the first time he's appearing in blackface, but it's a dedication and interpretation of the spirit of Harlem. And this is like idea of Blackness, right? That is kind of becoming part of American culture as being centered in Harlem. So this kind of move between a person, a real person, and I should also note that Fred Astaire's dancing is, he learned it from John W. Bubbles, sublet of Buck and Bubbles, who you can see here on the right. So it's like this kind of collapse of two individuals and a specific kind of dance history and a learning of dance. You know, Fred Astaire had to learn how to tap, and he learned that from Bubbles. And so his movement, as much as it's, you know, we can talk about it, whether it's like good or bad representation, which, you know, I think we might settle on bad representation, but it does do this, it kind of charts this lineage of dance, of Black dance.
And I would add that, like, and this, I think, in terms of my own work, the ways that I use performativity is that I think there's one of the ways that something like Fred Astaire's performance of Bubbles, right, like his facsimile of it, like one of the ways that it misunderstands the ways performance has been used, evolved in Black space, is that like Black joy is not the same as happiness. And even when the performance might outwardly give a sense of like jubilation, that it's like a complex, like our understanding of joy is that that is something that can exist and persevere and maintain even under great distress and duress. And so like understanding that there's more there than the smile is, I think, like a big separation from, like, for instance, Fred Astaire versus Bubbles. And also for me is something I play with in the work. So like having some of like the visual material, again, going back to this idea of film as material, the visual material that like reflects that sort of Hollywood understanding, or like that kind of a nostalgic imagery, but it's connected to what for me is an ongoing meditation and processing of what life has been like post-slavery for Black people in this country. And understanding that you can have those registers at the same time, and it's not an indication that all is well.
Yeah, and that is, especially in this case, you know, performance is just one aspect. Like, I think some of what your work does is kind of say, like, we can have these moments of being visible and choosing to be visible, but that still doesn't, that means that we have another part of our lives that is just not accessible to you. And it doesn't mean it's absent. It's just, it's a different kind of storytelling. And that's something that I've really have valued from your work. The last image that I'm just gonna leave on before we go into your work is this moment of like technological innovation that this number required, and this idea that, you know, as Astaire is doing this really elaborate tap sequence, he ends up in this kind of call and response with his shadow. And in doing so, his shadow becomes untethered from his body, and he ends up, they had to film it in this like new experimental way in order to create this kind of dance off between Astaire and his shadow. And one of the things that we spoke about, Madeleine, was you know, how in this case, like Blackness, the idea of Blackness seems to require a certain kind of innovation. It requires a new kind of experimentation. And I just kind of wanted to lead that into a question about how you understand cinema and what Blackness does in terms of storytelling.
Well, I am in love with this assertion that you shared with me too in our call, the idea that Blackness innovates and like forces the medium to innovate. I feel that is really true. And, you know, kind of bringing the conversation to thinking about film today, I think there's a lot of, within the industry, kind of across its breadth, there's a lot of insecurity about like, is film relevant? Like how does film continue to be relevant as kind of technology keeps moving? And I think that when I think of like what is the most innovative in film, it is always that intersection where like Blackness intervenes into the medium. Because as I said, it's, you know, really for Black people in image making, you're already working with a hostile technology that was created and refined as a way to categorize and rationalize Western expansion, the colonial project, American imperialism. And so you're working with a set of, with a language that essentially is hostile to your very existence. So you have no choice but in trying to use and wield that material or to exist in it, to essentially, if you'll excuse my language, to kind of fuck things up. You really have no choice but to rig the medium to make space for you. So yeah, I think that's something I'm going to take from our conversations, Kristin. That Blackness does force film to kind of reckon with it, and as a result, to innovate.
Thank you. We're going to move into the screening of Madeleine's work. I just want to give a brief kind of outline of description of them. So Footnote to the West is a dreamy fragment about the end of the world. A Black girl wanders into a Hollywood Western and mourns for the dead. Will be followed by Spit on the Broom, which is a surrealist documentary that explores the margins of the history of the African-American women's group, United Order of Tents, which is a clandestine organization of Black women organized in the 1840s during the height of the Underground Railroad. This film uses excerpts from the public record, newspaper articles related to the tents from over the course of 100 years, and creates a visual tapestry of fable and myth as a way to introduce a history that remains secret. Ask to cue the films, please. Hi. I want to give a couple of beats for people to type in a couple of questions, and maybe we'll go a little bit past the hour. But in that meantime, I would like to ask you a little bit more about the musical, the dance sequence, and how it came to be and who the dancers are, where you are?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to foreground the United Order of Tents, who are a secretive organization of African American women founded on the Underground Railroad. They're the oldest continuous organization of Black women in this country. And they started as a association of operatives running the Underground Railroad, thus the name for the need for secrecy. And they've really continued as a kind of soror organization into the 20th century, supporting their communities in various really important ways. But they've maintained that secrecy all these years. And so the challenge of Spit on the Broom was how to tell a story that remains a secret. And luckily in the archive, I found, advertisements that the Tents had placed for fundraisers that used something called a manless wedding, which was a very kind of standard social event of both women and men's clubs of the time, where you would stage the pageantry of a wedding without, cisgender performers. So you'd have like drag essentially to stage in this all women's space or all men's space a heterosexual appearing wedding. And it just really unlocked for me the use of pageantry in the kind of public facing, fundraiser facing, right? Like the event you could go to that the Tents had, which was different than the work they were doing secretly in their communities, primarily in the South, work that could have gotten them in trouble at times, in the South in the, mid 20th century. So that was the seed. And then, a lot is also just the magic of collaboration. But certainly in my understanding of cinema, my films are unreliable films in that, I'm not trying to work with a sense of like what should happen. I'm always looking to disrupt the experience. And I view myself as kind of like a chaos agent in film structure. That's really what I'm interested in. And regardless of the subject matter, those kind of formal decisions are really important in my work. And so, yeah, this was, I think, a very disruptive way to kind of play in this important archive.
One thing that's really continues to stand out to me is that kind of slow reveal. Like at first we're kind of we've like kind of just entered into this like suspended world of the film that you've created. And we're kind of like always, I think, what you were saying about disrupting expectations, like we're preparing ourselves for that, but we're like looking. And then just to have that slow pan to see that actually all of these people are also looking at the performers, and that this is not just this like kind of imaginary world, but actually a constructed world. And what you see is only what you're allowed to see until the camera pans back a bit more. And kind of just is like registering with some of the other things we've spoken about.
Yeah, I think that, for me, form is political, and form can model the ways that, the kinds of respect that you give to your material in form can model the kinds of respect you want people to give to material in life. And for me, like always destabilizing the sense of authority is a really important way of modeling how to negotiate the ways that archives, storytelling, film itself has treated Black stories, Black lives historically. Like it's really important to destabilize the sense that, that there's any kind of possible authoritative or singular narrative.
We have one question that's come in from Alex Jones, thanking us for the wonderful presentation. This question is about the use of reflective surfaces and mirrors across the two films. In both examples, the handheld mirror acts in a way that either centers first or obscures second the focal point of the scene. How do these sightlines function in your work, and how does the mirror impact the film's perspectives on Black selfhood and looking?
I love that question. For Spit on the Broom, I can say that I really love the Krista Thompson assertion that bling is opacity, shine is opacity. That was really, really exciting for me as an idea. And certainly when I looked into, because the Ten's history is so grounded in the Underground Railroad, and when I looked into okay, what would an operative have done on the Underground Railroad? A lot of it was about code and about, communicating in ways that wouldn't get you killed, to operate where safe houses were, to show another operative that, someone was in need of safe passage. And one of the ways they did that was mirror signs, catching the light from one location, a mile away to another. So in that case, there was great intention and kind of playing with this history. But again, I in thinking about mirrors and shine, I go back to Krista Thompson's brilliance, that, that shine and that light can also be opacity.
I'll take the last question is from Lauren Kramer. Again, thanking us for this program. She would like you to say more about your sculptural process. And I imagine in Spit on the Broom in particular, but I suppose it could also apply to Footnote to the West. For instance, is this a consideration when it comes to material in the film? She's thinking about the use of fabric and clothing, food, and of course, dance.
Yes, absolutely. Very much thinking about how to create really distinctive use of art direction that is playing with these registers of material. And again, thinking of, I guess, genre or convention as language, almost joints that can be used to construct something. So taking an kind of what we would taking an Antonioni shot as one kind of language, taking Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers is another piece of language, taking a piece of documentary footage as another piece of language, and understanding that configuration of those cinematic devices can create an experience that is, to me, a more dynamic, revealing experience than when we are able to just kind of receive what we expect in the package we accept it. And for me, that's, I think, what we need to be doing in film as filmmakers. I think that film is an art form and should be treated as an art form, and that we should be continuing to think of how we can work with it in ways that aren't just, kind of showing up and checking the boxes, shot, reverse shot, but that we're really, maximizing and innovating the medium as artists.
Thank you. Knowing Lauren Kramer's work a bit, I could imagine your use of the idea of joints and hinges is really, I think, particularly exciting, and this way that it creates this new kind of lineage, right? That you're creating a new cinematic lineage, a new kind of imaginative configuration of how we understand what works are in conversation with each other, what language is in conversation, and kind of creating a new way in which we can understand Black stories, Blackness. And I have one, go ahead, go ahead.
I would just add that, yeah, I mean, I really want to lift up that there are so many practices that do these things. And I just always encourage, because I think there's a lot of fear in like an audience that maybe like isn't in a cinephile space of like, how do I understand, or, you know, sit through, or like what should I make of like forms that are, you know, not kind of purely entertainment, or like doing like the things that we're kind of conditioned to think they should do. And again, I like my mom, for instance, she like, when I show her an experimental film, she's like, what are you having me watch? And I'm always like, you can, you know, it's okay to fall asleep in a film. Like even commercial films are kind of designed at times for that. Like it's okay for you to feel like deeply uncomfortable. And that like part of like making space for these like different kinds of forms is like also challenging ourselves as audience members. Like I love to challenge myself too in things that I watch.
I think that's a really great place to stop. I'm so grateful to you, Madeleine, for this conversation. It's been wonderful preparation, a wonderful conversation here today. I would like to encourage everyone to watch Swing Time. It will be available through tomorrow, and kind of put that into conversation, into context of what we've been speaking about today.
Kristin, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the Getty Research Institute. This was really a pleasure. And yeah, Swing Time stands the test of time. Okay.